The clinking of crystal champagne glasses and the low murmur of the city elite negotiating the fate of the corporate world filled the opulent ballroom. Weston Hale stood by the towering glass windows of his penthouse, looking down at the shimmering skyline of the city he practically owned. As the CEO of Hale Maritime, he was used to absolute control, surrounded by people who nodded at his every word. His oldest confidant, Julian Ashford, swirled his drink and laughed, breaking the silence. Julian had always been reckless, and tonight he was feeling particularly bold. He accused Weston of being entirely dependent on his family name, claiming that Weston could never command true respect without his wealth, and certainly could never find a woman who would look twice at him if he were an ordinary man. Pride flared in Weston. He turned from the window, his jaw set, and accepted the ridiculous wager Julian proposed. Weston had 30 days to find a complete stranger, someone far removed from their world of luxury, and marry her. It was a game of power, a test to prove he could mold anyone into the perfect high society wife without them ever knowing the truth of the bet. The next morning, an incredibly vague but highly lucrative job advertisement appeared in the local papers seeking a companion for high-profile corporate events. Margot Ellis stood behind the sticky counter of a rundown diner on the edge of the city, wiping away a coffee stain as she read the ad. She was exhausted, her hands rough from months of serving double shifts, but her mind was sharper than anyone in that diner could ever guess. Desperate for a way out of her grueling routine, she answered the ad. When she walked into the towering glass and steel headquarters of Hale Maritime, she was wearing a simple faded dress that belonged nowhere near the marble floors. Weston sat behind his massive mahogany desk, expecting a timid, easily manipulated woman. Instead, Margot met his gaze without a flicker of intimidation. When he laid out the absurd terms of his proposal, a contract of marriage for 1 year in exchange for a life-changing sum of money, she did not gasp or express gratitude. She simply analyzed the contract, pointed out a flaw in his non-disclosure clause, and told him his terms were as hollow as his corporate speeches. Weston was stunned. He was used to women who wanted his money or feared his power, but Margot looked at him as if she could see straight through the expensive tailored suit to the empty life he led. Their wedding was a cold, quiet affair in a judge's chambers. There was no romance, no flowers, only the scratching of pens on thick legal paper. When they arrived at his sprawling, silent penthouse, the reality of their arrangement settled in. Weston gestured to the lavish surroundings, expecting her to be mesmerized. Instead, Margot placed her worn canvas bag on a velvet chair and told him that all the space in the world could not make a home if there was no warmth in it. She refused the platinum credit card he offered her, stating firmly that she was there to fulfill a contract, not to be bought. Observing this strange new dynamic from the shadows was Victor Lang, a bitter member of the Hale Maritime Board of Directors. Victor had always despised Weston and was immediately suspicious of this sudden, unannounced marriage to a nobody. He began watching Margot closely, waiting for a mistake. The forced proximity began to chip away at their defenses. Margot refused to let Weston control her schedule, demanding she keep her part-time hours volunteering at a local community center. They argued fiercely in the marble kitchen, their voices echoing off the cold walls. He tried to buy her submission with a diamond necklace, leaving it on her vanity. She left it on his desk the next morning with a note saying she preferred things that carried real weight. Yet beneath the friction, a quiet attraction began to bloom. Late one night, Weston found her asleep on the sofa, a book about international maritime law resting on her chest. He carefully draped a blanket over her, his hand lingering for a moment near her shoulder. The next morning, he did not summon his private chef. Instead, he stood in the kitchen and painstakingly brewed coffee exactly the way she had once mentioned she liked it, leaving the mug steaming on the counter for her. It was a silent gesture of care that spoke louder than any of his wealth. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday evening. Victor Lang, having hired private investigators, burst into Weston's office with a thick manila folder. Victor threw the folder onto the desk, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. He revealed that Margot Ellis did not exist. The woman Weston had married was actually Margot Beaumont, the sole surviving heir to the Beaumont shipping empire. a rival family whose business had been destroyed in a ruthless takeover orchestrated by Weston's father years ago. Everyone believed Margot had died in the tragic accident that claimed her parents, but she had survived, giving up her name and wealth to escape the shadow of the corporate world. Weston felt the air leave his lungs. He confronted Margot in their penthouse, the dossier clutched in his hands. The revelation tore through the fragile trust they had built. Margot did not deny it. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke of the family she had lost, the pain of hiding for years, and the bitter irony of finding herself married to the son of the man who had ruined her life. She confessed that she had only agreed to the contract because she was destitute and desperate, completely unaware of his identity until it was too late. The silence that followed was deafening. Weston withdrew entirely, his pride wounded by the deception. They lived like ghosts in the massive penthouse, passing each other in the hallways without a word. But the coldness was a facade. When Margot fell suddenly ill with a severe fever, Weston's icy exterior shattered. He abruptly cancelled a multi-million-dollar merger meeting, ignoring the frantic calls from his executives, just to sit by her bed. He placed cool cloths on her forehead, holding her hand through the night, murmuring quiet words of comfort. It was a silent declaration of a love he was not yet brave enough to speak aloud. While Weston was distracted, Victor Lang made his final move. He called an emergency board meeting, inviting the press to the lobby of the Hale Maritime building. Victor planned to expose Margot's true identity to the media, framing Weston for committing corporate fraud by secretly marrying a rival heiress to merge the remaining Beaumont assets illegally. It was a perfect trap to force Weston to resign and hand over control of the company to Victor. As the cameras flashed and the board members murmured in shock, Weston stood at the podium, ready to take the fall to protect Margot's peace. But the double doors of the boardroom swung open. Margot walked in, no longer the tired waitress from the diner, but carrying the undeniable presence of a Beaumont. She did not come empty-handed. She stepped up to the microphone and with steady hands opened a leather-bound ledger. It was not a defense, it was a weapon. She presented irrefutable, meticulously gathered evidence of Victor Lang's decade-long embezzlement scheme, proving he had been siphoning millions from Hale Maritime into offshore accounts. She had used her quiet hours in the penthouse to dig into the company's financial archives, using her brilliant, inherited business mind to protect the man she had come to love. The room erupted. The flashes of the cameras turned on Victor, whose face drained of color as the police stepped forward to escort him out of the building. He was stripped of his title, his dignity, and his freedom in a matter of minutes. When the chaos subsided and the room cleared, Weston and Margot were left alone in the quiet boardroom. Weston walked slowly toward her, the weight of his past arrogance heavy on his shoulders. He looked into her eyes and offered a genuine, profound apology, not just for the foolish bet that had brought them together, but for his pride, for the pain his family had caused hers, and for ever doubting her. He told her that he did not want a contract, nor did he care about the names they carried. He only wanted her. Margot looked at the man who had given up his empire for a night just to hold her hand when she was sick, and she finally let down her guard, stepping into his arms. Years later, the Hale penthouse felt entirely different. It was no longer a cold museum of wealth, but a home filled with warmth and the sound of laughter. Margot stood on the balcony, looking out at the city skyline. She was now the head of the Beaumont Foundation, an organization she had built from the ground up with Weston's unwavering support, dedicated to helping families displaced by corporate greed. Weston stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They had rebuilt their lives, not on a foundation of lies or bets, but on mutual respect, deep love, and a shared vision for the future. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow along with our next stories. We will see you next time. The heavy oak doors of the Vale Capital boardroom slammed shut, echoing like a gavel through the empty corridor. Adrian Vale paced across the Persian rug, running a hand through his hair in rare frustration. His late grandfather had built the investment empire from nothing, but the old man had left behind a bizarre and ironclad clause in his final will. Adrian could only inherit his rightful place as the majority shareholder if he married within the month. It was a manipulative attempt from beyond the grave to force Adrian into settling down, a concept he entirely despised. He had spent his life treating relationships like corporate mergers, calculating risks and cutting losses. The thought of tying himself to one of the superficial socialites in his circle made his blood run cold. He needed a business arrangement, a woman who understood contracts and boundaries, someone who would take a massive payout and disappear when the year was up. Sienna Hayes dropped a stack of heavily redacted financial reports onto Adrian's mahogany desk, breaking his dark train of thought. She was his newly hired personal assistant, a woman the rest of the executive floor despised because she refused to engage in their office politics. Sienna wore sensible shoes, unbranded coats, and possessed an infuriatingly calm demeanor that usually drove Adrian crazy. When he barked an order at her, expecting her to cower like her predecessors, she simply corrected his tone and handed him his black coffee. Adrian looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She was fiercely intelligent, pragmatic, and clearly desperate for the grueling salary the job provided. Without a second thought, he locked the office door and laid out the strangest proposal of her life. He offered her $5 million to be his wife on paper for 1 year. Sienna did not faint or laugh. Her eyes darkened with a shadow of past survival, and she methodically calculated the offer. She agreed, mentioning only that the money would finally allow her to fix a debt that was not hers to pay. They were married at a secluded coastal courthouse as a heavy fog rolled in from the ocean. There was no celebration, only the rigid exchange of signatures on a thick prenuptial agreement. When they arrived at Adrian's sprawling cliffside estate, Sienna politely declined the master suite and the extravagant wardrobe budget he had established for her. She told him that clothes bought with his money would never feel like her own, and she had no interest in playing dress-up for his ego. Watching this bizarre dynamic unfold was Clarissa Wade, Adrian's calculating ex-fiancée. Clarissa had always planned to maneuver her way back into Adrian's wealth, and was deeply insulted that he had chosen his plain, unremarkable assistant over her. Clarissa immediately sensed that the marriage was a sham, and began quietly making calls, determined to dig up whatever dirt she could find on the new Mrs. Vale. Life inside the estate was a battle of silent wills. Sienna continued to work as his assistant during the day, maintaining a strict professional boundary that frustrated Adrian more than he wanted to admit. When they were alone in the evenings, the tension shifted. They argued passionately about his cynical view of the world and her stubborn refusal to accept even the smallest comforts he offered. Yet, the ice between them began to crack. One evening, after a grueling 14-hour workday, the power grid in the estate failed. Sitting on the floor of the living room, illuminated only by a single candle, Sienna finally let her guard down. They talked not about contracts or acquisitions, but about the quiet fears they both carried. Adrian found himself mesmerized by the way the candlelight danced in her eyes, realizing that her strength was the most beautiful thing he had ever encountered. The fragile peace shattered violently on a Tuesday morning. A prominent financial journalist published a massive front-page exposé on Sienna's past, tipped off anonymously by Clarissa. The article revealed that Sienna was the daughter of a disgraced accountant who had been falsely blamed for a devastating Ponzi scheme years ago. The scandal had bankrupted her family, driven her father to an early grave, and left Sienna destitute, fighting to clear a name everyone else had cursed. Adrian read the article with a tight jaw, feeling a sharp betrayal that she had never trusted him enough to share her burden. When he confronted her in his office, the pain in her voice was raw. She told him about the nights spent sleeping in her car, the doors slammed in her face, and the agonizing memory of watching her family lose everything. She had kept it a secret because in his world of billionaires, poverty and scandal were treated like infectious diseases. Adrian retreated behind his walls of ice, punishing her with complete, suffocating silence. He stopped asking her to join him for dinner and communicated only through brief professional emails. But underneath the cold exterior, he was moving mountains. He did not buy her apology gifts of diamonds or cars. Instead, Sienna began finding unmarked manila folders on her desk every morning. Inside were confidential documents, bank records, and legal briefs. Adrian was using his vast resources to silently hunt down the real architects of the Ponzi scheme that had destroyed her family. It was his quiet, desperate way of proving that he cared, protecting her in the only language he knew how to speak. Enraged that her initial leak had not destroyed their marriage, Clarissa escalated her attack. She organized a lavish charity gala, inviting the city's most ruthless investors and the very journalist who had written the exposé. Clarissa cornered Sienna near the grand staircase, threatening to publicly accuse Adrian of corporate fraud, claiming he had fabricated the marriage to illegally secure the Vale inheritance. Clarissa intended to paint Sienna as a master manipulator and a gold digger, threatening to drag the Hayes family name through the mud a second time unless Sienna filed for divorce and walked away that very night. But Clarissa had fundamentally miscalculated the situation. When she took the stage to make her grand, destructive speech, the journalist she had invited stepped up to the microphone instead. Adrian had not just been investigating Sienna's past, he had been investigating Clarissa's present. The journalist exposed a trail of devastating evidence showing that Clarissa had been illegally shorting the stocks of the very charities she claimed to support, using blackmail to fund her lavish lifestyle. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, as the city elite pulled away from Clarissa as if she were made of fire. Her investors abandoned her on the spot, turning their backs as she wept in humiliation, her reputation entirely dismantled in front of the people she valued most. Later that night, standing on the balcony of their estate, Adrian finally dropped all his armor. He took Sienna's hands, his voice thick with an emotion he had spent his whole life burying. He apologized for his pride, for the silence that had hurt her, and for treating their lives like a transaction. He tore up the marriage contract in front of her, letting the pieces scatter into the ocean wind. He told her he did not want an assistant, and he did not want a business partner. He only wanted the woman who had taught him how to feel again. Sienna looked at the man who had fought in the shadows to restore her honor, and for the first time in her life, she stopped fighting. She pulled him into a deep, sweeping kiss that erased every trace of the contract that had brought them together. Months later, the boardroom at Vale Capital sat empty, but Adrian did not care. Having secured his inheritance, he immediately handed over the daily operations to a trusted board of directors. Adrian and Sienna packed their lives into a few simple bags and left the toxic world of high society behind. They moved to a quiet coastal town in Europe, where they established a legal defense fund dedicated entirely to helping victims of financial fraud. Walking barefoot along the beach at sunset, Sienna rested her head against Adrian's shoulder, finally at peace. They had traded an empire of gold for a life of genuine freedom, proving that the greatest wealth was the love they had fought so hard to build. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow along with our next stories. We will see you next time. The flash of cameras outside the Sterling Capitol building was relentless. Damien Sterling, cold and calculated, watched the media circus from his tinted limousine. A vicious corporate dispute with a rival firm had tanked his company's public image. The board demanded a picture-perfect relationship to stabilize the stock and project stability. His controlling father, Arthur Sterling, ruthlessly ordered Damien to find a respectable woman immediately, treating marriage like a hostile acquisition. Damien had a different idea. He needed a weapon. His eyes fell on a dossier containing a photograph of Lila Monroe, the quiet and dignified ex-fiancée of his biggest rival. She had been publicly humiliated when her engagement ended, making her the perfect pawn for Damien's corporate revenge and a flawless shield for the media. Damien orchestrated their first encounter at a dimly lit jazz club, where Lila was listening to the music alone. He slid into the booth across from her, expecting her to be fragile and easily intimidated by his wealth. Instead, Lila met his gaze with a steady, unyielding calm. When Damien proposed a financial arrangement, offering to pay off her massive accumulated debts in exchange for 6 months of pretending to be his adoring wife, she did not flinch. She pointed out the emptiness of his revenge and sharply criticized his lack of a moral compass. However, desperation flickered in her eyes, a subtle hint of a burden she carried entirely alone. After a long, tense silence, she agreed, demanding ironclad boundaries and strict financial independence. Their union was formalized in a sterile attorney's office, devoid of any warmth. When they arrived at Damien's towering penthouse, Lila immediately rejected the opulent master suite and the extravagant wardrobe he had ordered for her. She told him firmly that she was an employee of his public relations strategy, not a doll to be dressed up for his amusement. Hovering over this icy arrangement was Arthur Sterling. The older man visited the penthouse and glared at Lila with profound classist disdain, warning Damien that bringing a woman with a ruined reputation into the family would destroy their legacy. Lila stood her ground, refusing to look away from the cruel patriarch. The following weeks were filled with tense public appearances and private friction. Damien tried to exert control over her schedule, but Lila fiercely defied him, insisting on maintaining her quiet life away from the cameras. She openly mocked the superficiality of his world, refusing the lavish diamond bracelets he tried to give her to sell the facade. Yet, behind closed doors, a quiet shift occurred. Damien noticed that she always arranged his scattered desk notes perfectly, and she noticed the dark circles under his eyes, quietly leaving a glass of water and aspirin by his chair after his long nights. The forced proximity bred an undeniable, simmering attraction that neither wanted to admit. The fragile balance shattered one evening after a grueling charity dinner. Lila collapsed in the hallway of the penthouse, her breath ragged and her face pale. Panic seized Damien as he rushed her to the hospital, abandoning every ounce of his usual cold composure. In the quiet, sterile hospital room, she finally told him the truth. She was battling a severe, degenerative heart condition, a secret she had hidden from everyone. The crippling debts she carried were entirely from her experimental medical treatments. She had agreed to Damien's cold arrangement because it was the only way to afford a life-saving surgery. The revelation struck Damien like a physical blow, tearing away his arrogance and replacing it with a profound, terrifying ache. Hurt that she had viewed him only as a bank account and had not trusted him with her pain, Damien withdrew into a heavy silence. He stopped bringing her to corporate events, keeping her shielded in the penthouse, but his coldness was a desperate mask. He secretly contacted the top cardiac specialists in the world, sparing absolutely no expense behind her back. He began making her meals himself, ensuring they met her strict dietary needs, and sat by her bed while she slept, holding her hand when he thought she could not feel it. It was a quiet, desperate vigil of a man terrified of losing something he had just realized he needed. While Damien was focused entirely on Lila's health, Arthur Sterling made his final, ruthless move. Having discovered the truth about her illness, Arthur confronted Lila while Damien was out meeting with surgeons. The older man threw a checkbook on the table, demanding she take the money and vanish. He threatened to leak her medical records to the press, framing her as a fragile, dying liability who had tricked his son, a scandal that would obliterate Damien's position in the company. Arthur sneered that a sick woman could never be a true Sterling, demanding she file for divorce before she dragged his empire down with her. Damien returned just as his father delivered the ultimatum. Instead of crumbling, Lila stood tall, her voice steady as she told Arthur that a legacy built on cruelty was not worth protecting. Damien stepped to her side, his fury absolute. He did not yell. Instead, he summoned the board of directors to an emergency meeting the next morning. Standing before the most powerful investors in the city, Damien did not hide Lila. He brought her with him. He publicly exposed his father's extortion attempt and the decades of toxic, manipulative control Arthur had wielded over the company. The room watched in stunned silence as Arthur's allies slowly turned away, disgusted by his willingness to destroy a sick woman to secure his own power. Arthur was stripped of his chairmanship, losing the respect of everyone he had ruled through fear. Later that evening, the penthouse was finally quiet. Damien sat beside Lila on the sofa, gently taking her hands in his. The walls between them had completely fallen. He confessed that he no longer cared about the company, the media, or the revenge that had brought them together. He apologized for using her as a pawn and promised that he would spend every single day fighting alongside her. It was a raw, honest declaration of love, spoken softly into the quiet night. Lila leaned against him, the fear that had haunted her for years finally melting away as she realized she no longer had to carry her burden alone. The seasons changed, and so did their world. Lila survived her surgery, her strength returning day by day. Damien organized a massive public gala, but this time there were no lies and no hidden motives. Standing before the cameras, he formally recognized her not just as his wife, but as the bravest person he had ever known, publicly apologizing for the foolish contract that had started their journey. They transformed the sterling legacy together, directing millions into healthcare initiatives for those who could not afford treatment. They had turned a bitter corporate dispute into a foundation of genuine love and healing. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love and resilience. Subscribe to the channel to follow along with our next stories. We will see you next time.